Colonial taverns weren't just places to grab a drink. They were the heartbeat of 1700s America. Inside those smoky rooms, you'd find travelers feasting on turtle soup, merchants sealing deals over cider, and rebels whispering about revolution between bites of roasted venison. These weren't ordinary meals. They were the fuel of a new nation being born. Today, we're stepping back into those taverns to uncover 25 surprising foods that filled plates, fired up conversations, and in their own way, helped shape the course of American history. Stick around because some of these dishes will shock you, and a few might just tempt you to try them yourself. 1. Mutton stew with ale. If there was one dish that kept colonial taverns alive, it was mutton stew with ale. Imagine a heavy iron pot simmering by the fire, filled with tough cuts of sheep, onions, root vegetables, and, of course, a generous pour of ale. This wasn't fine dining. It was comfort food, built to warm the bones of farmers, soldiers, and travelers who'd spent all day on horseback or in the fields. Here's the secret. Taverns often used ale instead of water in their stews. Why? Water wasn't always clean, but ale was safe, and it added a deep malty flavor that turned cheap mutton into something rich and satisfying. A single bowl could feed a man for hours, and with bread to soak up the broth, nothing went to waste. Think about it. In today's money, a hearty bowl like this might cost less than $3 to make at home. Back then, it was priceless fuel for long journeys and long debates about freedom. And for many colonists, that hot stew by a smoky hearth was the closest thing to comfort in a world full of uncertainty. But the tavern menu didn't stop at stew. Next up, a dish so decadent it turned heads whenever it hit the table. 2. Roast suckling pig. Now, if mutton stew was the common man's meal, roast suckling pig was the showstopper. Picture it. A whole piglet, slow-roasted over an open fire, its skin turning golden and crisp, the fat basting the meat as it cooked. When the tavern keeper carried that platter through the smoky room, every head turned. This wasn't just dinner. It was a statement. In the 1700s, meat was expensive, and a suckling pig meant someone had money to spend or a reason to celebrate. Birthdays, harvest feasts, political victories, all of them could call for pig on the table. It symbolized abundance in a world where scarcity was the norm. But here's the kicker. While the wealthy carved the tender meat, the tavern keeper made sure nothing went to waste. The head, the trotters, even the scraps would be boiled down into soups or pies for others. A single pig fed dozens, making it both a luxury and a community event. Imagine this in 2025 terms. Serving a whole roast pig at a backyard gathering might set you back a few $100, but it would still draw the same kind of awe it did back then. A centerpiece that said, "This is more than a meal, this is a memory." And yet, the taverns didn't just serve meat on bones. The next dish combined the land and the sea in one surprising pie. 3. Beef and oyster pie. Here's a dish that might sound strange today, but in colonial taverns it was pure genius: beef and oyster pie. Think about it. Rich cuts of beef stewed until tender, layered with briny oysters, all baked under a golden crust. Land and sea together in one pie. Why oysters? Because in the 1700s, oysters weren't a delicacy. They were cheap and plentiful. Taverns near the coast could scoop them by the bucket. Mixing them with beef stretched the meat further and added a salty, savory punch that colonists absolutely loved. Imagine biting into a forkful, the deep, meaty flavor of beef colliding with the ocean's brine, all wrapped in buttery pastry. It was comfort food with a surprise. And here's the kicker. This wasn't a poor man's dish or a rich man's dish. It was for everyone. Travelers, merchants, even statesmen passing through could be found spooning into a hot slice of beef and oyster pie while trading gossip about British taxes. In today's terms, you could probably make a hearty version for under $10 if you used stew beef and a can of oysters. Back then, it was a filling, flavorful way to feed a crowd And one more reason taverns were the true melting pot of colonial America. But if that pie raised eyebrows, wait until you see what came next, a dish that brought refinement and a touch of elegance to otherwise rowdy tavern tables. Fourth, veal cutlets with mushroom sauce. Not every tavern dish was rough and heavy. Sometimes the menu leaned toward elegance, like veal cutlets with mushroom sauce. Picture thin slices of tender veal, pan-fried until golden, then smothered in a rich sauce made from wild mushrooms, butter, and herbs. Compared to stews and pies, this looked almost refined, the kind of dish that made a weary merchant or lawyer feel like they were dining in Europe, not a smoky colonial tavern. The secret was in the mushrooms. Many weren't purchased, they were foraged from nearby woods. That added a rustic local flavor and kept costs down, though it carried risks. One wrong mushroom could ruin the meal. Still, when it worked, the sauce transformed humble meat into something special, something worth talking about over a mug of ale. Of course, veal wasn't cheap. Even then, it was a splurge. In modern terms, you're looking at $20 to $25 a plate if served in a restaurant. But for colonists, ordering veal at a tavern wasn't just about the food. It was about the statement. It said, "I'm not just surviving, I'm living well." And that balance between survival and luxury is what made taverns magical. One table might have men with mutton stew, another with roasted pig, and in the corner, someone savoring veal in mushroom sauce, tasting a little slice of refinement in a rough new world. 5. Pickled cabbage relish. If the veal was refined, pickled cabbage relish was the sharp, no-nonsense companion that cut through heavy tavern fare. Imagine a crock of cabbage, brined with vinegar, salt, mustard seed, maybe a little pepper, tangy, crunchy, and strong enough to wake you up after a few tankards of ale. This relish wasn't just about flavor, it was about survival. In a world without refrigeration, pickling was how colonists stretched their harvest through winter. A single barrel of cabbage could last months, making it one of the cheapest, most reliable sides a tavern could serve. It refreshed the palate after fatty meats, and it kept scurvy at bay when fresh produce was scarce. Cost-wise, it was almost nothing, pennies compared to meat. In 2025, you could make a whole jar for under $2. But in colonial times, that sour crunch carried a sense of security. Food that lasted, food that traveled, food that reminded you of home when you were miles away. And here's the kicker. While it was a side dish, taverns used relish like a secret weapon. It kept customers coming back because even the simplest meal felt balanced, alive, and memorable. From tangy cabbage, the tavern tables swung back to warm comfort, and nothing said comfort quite like chicken simmered slowly in sweet apple cider. 6. Apple cider braised chicken. Few tavern dishes captured the flavor of colonial America like apple cider braised chicken. Imagine a plump bird simmering low and slow in a pot of fresh-pressed cider, onions, and herbs. The result? Meat so tender it fell off the bone, wrapped in a sweet savory sauce that smelled like autumn itself. Cider wasn't just a drink, it was everywhere. Colonists drank it daily because clean water wasn't always reliable, and apples grew in abundance. Using cider in cooking gave chicken a tangy, almost caramelized flavor, turning a simple farmyard bird into something rich enough for a traveler to remember long after the meal. For taverns, this dish was genius. Chickens were cheap, cider was plentiful, and the stew pot could stretch to feed a crowd. In 2025 terms, you could make a pot for under $10 and serve 4 to 6 people. Back then, it meant a hearty, filling meal that paired perfectly with crusty bread and, of course, another mug of ale. But this dish carried more than comfort. It carried community. A pot of cider-braised chicken set in the middle of a table invited sharing, laughter, and debate. Maybe even the first sparks of revolution. And if chicken simmered in cider felt like warmth by the fire, the next dish was something tougher, earthier. Survival boiled down to its core. 7. Salted beef and turnip pottage. If cider braised chicken was comfort, Salted beef and turnip pottage was pure survival. This was the kind of dish taverns leaned on when supplies ran low and winter nights dragged long. Imagine a heavy pot filled with chunks of tough, salty beef, softened by hours of boiling, with earthy turnips and maybe a few carrots thrown in to stretch it further. Salt was the secret. It preserved meat for months, letting taverns feed travelers even when fresh cuts were scarce. But that same salt made the beef almost inedible until it was cooked down in a stew. The turnips, cheap, hardy, and easy to grow, mellowed the saltiness and gave the broth a filling, rustic flavor. It wasn't glamorous, but it was dependable. Soldiers, farmers, and riders stopping at a tavern could count on a bowl of pottage to keep them going. In today's money, you could make a pot big enough to feed 6 for less than $12, the kind of meal that stretches dollars, just like it stretched supplies back then. And here's the thing. While no one bragged about eating salted beef and turnips, it was the kind of humble dish that kept bellies full and spirits steady. Without meals like this, taverns couldn't have stayed open, and weary colonists wouldn't have had the strength for the road ahead. But not every tavern dish was so plain. Some had sweetness, warmth, and a touch of comfort you'd never forget. 8. Indian pudding, cornmeal and molasses. After the salty heaviness of beef and turnips, taverns often offered something warm and sweet, Indian pudding. Despite the name, it wasn't Native American in origin. It was a colonial invention. Made from cornmeal, molasses, milk, and spices, it was baked slowly until thick, rich, and custardy. Why cornmeal? Because wheat was expensive and often imported, but corn grew abundantly in New England. Colonists adapted, turning corn into bread, mush, and, in this case, dessert. Add molasses, cheap thanks to the triangular trade, and you had a dish that was filling, affordable, and comforting. The pudding came out dark and sticky, flavored with cinnamon or nutmeg if the tavern had them. Served warm, it was like the 1700s version of comfort food, a treat that soothed after a long ride or a tough day of work. Some taverns even drizzled cream on top for a little luxury. Here's the kicker. In 2025, you could make a pan of Indian pudding for under $5, enough to serve a whole family. Back then, it was just as economical, sweet enough to feel indulgent, cheap enough to keep taverns profitable. And in a smoky room filled with ale mugs and political debates, a bowl of warm pudding reminded everyone that even in uncertain times, there was still room for sweetness. But sweetness didn't always come in custard form. Sometimes it came straight from the sea, rich, hearty, and steaming in a bowl. 9. Clam chowder with milk. Few dishes scream Colonial Tavern comfort, quite like clam chowder with milk. Imagine a steaming bowl of clams, potatoes, onions, and salt pork, all simmered together in a creamy broth. It was warm, filling, and perfect after a cold ride along the New England coast. Here's the surprising part. In the 1700s, clams were everywhere and dirt cheap. They weren't a delicacy. They were a poor man's food, scooped from the shore by the bucket. Mixing them with milk and root vegetables stretched the meal, turning simple ingredients into something hearty enough to satisfy a tavern full of hungry travelers. The milk gave it richness, the clams added briny depth, and the salt pork tied it all together. Served with hard bread or a biscuit, it was a dish that stuck to your ribs and kept you going through long nights of debate, drinking, and storytelling. Cost-wise, it was one of the cheapest tavern meals. In today's money, you could whip up a pot for under $10, feeding 5 or 6 people. Back then, it was an economical staple, comfort in a bowl made from what the land and sea provided. And here's the thing. While the revolution was brewing outside, inside the tavern, a bowl of chowder reminded folks of home. It was humble, simple, but unforgettable. But when it came to sweet endings, taverns had another trick up their sleeve, one thick, sticky, and rich with molasses. 10. Molasses pudding. If chowder was the warmth of the sea, molasses pudding was the sweetness of the land. This tavern staple was simple, flour or cornmeal, eggs if the cook had them, and a heavy pour of blackstrap molasses baked into a dense, sticky pudding. No fancy frosting, no delicate presentation, just a dark, rich dessert that filled the air with the smell of sugarcane and spice. Why molasses? Because it was cheap, plentiful, and tied directly to the colonial trade routes. Imported from the Caribbean, molasses became the sweetener of choice for ordinary folks who couldn't afford refined sugar. Taverns leaned on it heavily, turning a few humble ingredients into something that felt indulgent after a day of salted beef or pottage. The pudding was hearty enough to serve as both dessert and breakfast the next morning, making it a practical choice for tavern keepers. Travelers loved it because it felt like a rare treat, sweet, filling, and comforting in a world where luxury was scarce. Today, you could make a pan of molasses pudding for less than $6, feeding a family for days. Back then, it was a budget-friendly way to end a meal on a high note. And here's the kicker. While revolution was brewing outside tavern doors, inside, a slice of pudding reminded colonists that even in uncertain times, sweetness could still be found. But the menu wasn't done surprising. Next up, a dish that carried the weight of tradition and herbs straight from the tavern garden. 11. Roast capon with herbs. If molasses pudding was rustic comfort, roast capon with herbs was the tavern's touch of elegance. A capon, a castrated rooster, produced tender, juicy meat, richer than chicken but not as gamey as wild fowl. When roasted over an open hearth and seasoned with garden herbs like sage, thyme, and parsley, it became a dish that smelled as good as it tasted. This wasn't an everyday meal. Capons were more expensive than chickens, so taverns served them on special occasions or for wealthier guests who wanted something finer than stew. But when a roast capon hit the table, it turned heads. The golden skin, the aroma of herbs, and the promise of tender meat made it a centerpiece worthy of celebration. What made it special was the simplicity. No complicated sauces, no heavy breading, just honest roasting with herbs grown in the kitchen garden. It reminded colonists of old-world traditions while showing off the abundance of the New World. In today's terms, roasting a capon would cost maybe $25 to $30, but it could feed a whole family. Back then, it was luxury wrapped in simplicity, proof that taverns weren't only about filling bellies, but about creating moments worth remembering. And right alongside that golden roast, taverns often served something humbler, but no less hearty, a pie of onions and potatoes that stretched simple ingredients into pure comfort. 12. Onion and potato pie. Not every tavern dish was grand or expensive. Some, like onion and potato pie, were built out of pure necessity. Picture layers of sliced potatoes and sweet onions baked under a simple crust, with maybe a splash of cream or broth if the tavern had it. It was humble, filling, and cheap, the kind of dish that kept travelers going without draining their purse. Potatoes were just becoming common in colonial America, and taverns quickly learned they were perfect for stretching meals. Paired with onions, a crop that stored well through winter, this pie became a reliable standby. It wasn't flashy, but it delivered warmth and energy to tired riders, farmers, and merchants. Flavor-wise, it was rustic but comforting. Tender onions turning sweet as they baked, potatoes soaking up every drop of savory juice. Served with bread and ale, it made a meal that cost next to nothing but felt satisfying after a long journey. In modern terms, you could whip up a whole pie for under $5, feeding 4 people easily. Back then, that same value made it a tavern favorite. Proof that simple food, done right, could hold its own alongside roast meats and rich puddings. And for those craving something sweet after a savory pie, taverns had just the thing: golden fritters dusted with cinnamon. 13. Apple fritters with cinnamon. If onion and potato pie was hearty comfort, apple fritters with cinnamon were pure delight. Imagine hot chunks of apple dipped in batter, fried until golden, then rolled in sugar and cinnamon. Served fresh from the pan, they were crisp on the outside, soft and sweet inside, the kind of treat that made even the rowdiest tavern-goer pause for a smile. Apples were everywhere in colonial America, and taverns used them in everything from cider to stews. Turning them into fritters was genius. Cheap fruit, cheap batter, and a sprinkle of spice turned into something that felt almost luxurious. Cinnamon, often imported from the Indies, gave the fritters an exotic touch that made them more than just fried apples. Travelers loved them because they were quick, warm, and comforting, a snack that paired perfectly with a mug of cider or ale. And for tavern keepers, fritters were cost-effective crowd pleasers. In today's money, you could fry up a whole batch for under $4, enough to feed a table. Back then, they carried the taste of sweetness in a world where desserts were rare. And here's the magic. While big roasts and stews filled the body, fritters fed the spirit. They were small bites of joy in smoky rooms where history itself was being plotted. But sweetness had another form in taverns, darker, spicier, and baked into a loaf that filled the room with its scent. 14. Gingerbread loaf. If apple fritters were a quick bite of joy, gingerbread loaf was the slow, steady comfort that lingered. Picture a dark, spiced bread baked dense with molasses, ginger, and cloves, sliced thick and served alongside ale or tea. In a smoky tavern, the smell alone could draw customers to the table. Molasses was the star here, cheap and plentiful, while ginger and cloves gave it an exotic kick, proof of how global trade reached even colonial kitchens. For travelers, a slice of gingerbread felt both familiar and festive, like carrying a piece of home on the road. It was sweet, but hearty enough to double as breakfast the next morning. For tavern keepers, gingerbread was smart business. It lasted days without spoiling, cost very little to make, and paired well with just about any drink. In modern terms, you could bake a whole loaf for under $6, feeding a family for a week. Back then, it was both dessert and staple, a reminder that even simple ingredients could create something special. And here's the thing. While tavern tables rang with debates about liberty and taxes, gingerbread grounded people. It was steady, reliable, and sweet in a world where life was often bitter. But not every dish was gentle. Some packed the fiery punch of ale and spice in every bite. 15. Ale-soaked sausages. If gingerbread loaf whispered comfort, ale-soaked sausages shouted celebration. Picture plump sausages sizzling in a pan, doused with strong tavern ale, and left to soak up the malty, bitter punch. The result was smoky, juicy meat, infused with the flavor of the drink everyone already had in their mugs. This dish wasn't fancy. It was hearty, bold, and loud, just like the taverns themselves. The ale cut through the fattiness, giving the sausages a tang that kept patrons reaching for another bite, and another round of beer. It was the kind of food designed to fuel long nights of storytelling, singing, and maybe a brawl or two. For tavern keepers, it was also practical. Sausages could be made in bulk from leftover scraps of pork or beef, heavily salted and spiced to last. Add ale, something taverns always had plenty of, and you had a dish that was cheap, filling, and profitable. In today's terms, a skillet of ale-soaked sausages might cost under $10 to make, but it could keep half a dozen customers drinking for hours. And here's the kicker. While the revolution may have been sparked over politics and principles, it was dishes like this, greasy and rich, that fueled the fiery debates late into the night. But not all tavern fare was wild and rowdy. Some dishes carried a touch of refinement, served with mustard and carved carefully for the plate. 16. Boiled ham with mustard sauce. After the rowdy punch of ale-soaked sausages, taverns often balanced things with something steadier. Boiled ham with mustard sauce. A whole ham, cured and salted, was simmered until tender, then sliced thick and served with a sharp mustard sauce that cut right through the richness. Ham was a tavern staple because it kept well. Once salted or smoked, it could last through long winters or long sea voyages. For tavern keepers, that meant reliability, meat they could count on when fresh cuts weren't available. The mustard sauce, usually made with vinegar and ground seeds, added a tangy kick that made each bite feel brighter. This dish was hearty, but also practical. One ham could feed dozens, and the sauce stretched flavor without adding much cost. In 2025 money, you could prepare a full ham dinner for around $20 and serve an entire family for days. Back then, it was the perfect mix of thrift and satisfaction. And here's what made it special. It wasn't just food, it was fellowship. A platter of ham set down in a Smoky tavern meant sharing, talking, and lingering over tankards of cider. It was a dish that filled both belly and spirit. But taverns weren't all meat and salt. They also knew the value of green freshness, even if it was simple and seasonal. 17. Buttered peas with mint. Amid the heavy meats and dark puddings, taverns sometimes served something bright and fresh. Buttered peas with mint. Simple but unforgettable. Tender peas simmered until just soft, tossed with a knob of butter, and finished with a handful of fresh mint from the tavern garden. In an era where much of the food was salted, pickled, or boiled to death, this little side dish felt alive. The butter gave it richness, the mint gave it freshness, and together they balanced the heaviness of pork, beef, or bread-heavy meals. For travelers who'd been eating salted rations on the road, a spoonful of green peas felt almost like medicine. Cost-wise, it was one of the cheapest offerings on the tavern table. Peas grew abundantly, and mint was practically free if you had a patch of dirt outside the kitchen. In today's terms, you could make a whole bowl for just a few dollars. Back then, it was a way to stretch harvests and remind guests that tavern fare wasn't always about survival. Sometimes it was about a touch of freshness. And that's what made it stick. Amid debates over freedom and politics, a simple side of peas could bring a taste of spring to even the darkest winter. But freshness aside, taverns always circled back to hearty comfort. And nothing said comfort like a steaming pot of chicken and dumplings. 18. Chicken and dumplings. If there was one dish that defined pure tavern comfort, it was chicken and dumplings. Picture a bubbling pot filled with tender chicken simmered in broth, with soft, doughy dumplings floating on top, fluffy bites that soaked up every drop of savory flavor. This was the kind of meal that filled not just the stomach, but the soul. Chickens were relatively cheap, and the dumplings were just flour, fat, and water. Simple ingredients stretched into something hearty. For a weary rider or farmer, a bowl of chicken and dumplings felt like home, even if they were miles away. Tavern keepers loved it too. One pot could feed a crowd, and it was easy to keep simmering over the fire all day. In today's terms, you could make a pot for under $12, serving an entire family. Back then, it was one of the most economical dishes on the menu, filling, warm, and comforting enough to make people linger a little longer with their mugs of cider. And here's the beauty of it. While roasted pig and veal cutlets impressed, it was humble chicken and dumplings that kept people coming back. It wasn't flashy. It was dependable, familiar, and deeply satisfying. But when taverns wanted to end a meal with something sweet and heavy, they turned to a dish packed with fat, raisins, and old-world tradition. 19. Suet pudding with raisins. After the cozy comfort of chicken and dumplings, taverns often turned to suet pudding with raisins for dessert. Heavy, rich, and a little rustic, it was made from flour, breadcrumbs, beef suet, the fat around kidneys, molasses or sugar, and a handful of raisins for sweetness. Steamed or boiled until dense and moist, it was the kind of pudding that stuck with you long after the meal. To modern ears, the idea of beef fat in dessert sounds strange, but back then it was practical and delicious. Suet gave the pudding its structure, while raisins, imported and therefore special, added bursts of sweetness that made the dish feel like a treat. Served with a drizzle of cream or sauce, it was a taste of Old England that reminded colonists of their roots. For tavern keepers, this pudding was smart business. It used scraps and cheap ingredients, yet felt rich enough to satisfy guests. In today's terms, you could steam a whole pudding for under $8, serving a big group. Back then, it was affordable indulgence, proof that even the rough-and-tumble tavern life had its sweet rewards. And while puddings carried the weight of tradition, taverns also knew how to borrow from the sea. frying up fish with ale batter so crisp it could rival any modern pub. 20. Ale-battered haddock. Taverns weren't just about stews and puddings. Sometimes they served food that felt downright festive. Ale-battered haddock was one of those dishes. Picture a fresh fillet of white fish dipped in a batter made with tavern ale, then fried until golden and crisp. When it hit the table, it was crunchy on the outside, flaky on the inside, and perfect with a squeeze of lemon or a dollop of mustard sauce. Fish like haddock was common along the colonial coast, and frying it in ale batter gave tavern cooks a way to turn something simple into a crowd-pleaser. The ale made the batter light and airy, while also giving it a malty flavor that paired perfectly with, you guessed it, another mug of beer. For travelers, this was a treat. After days of salted beef or tough bread, a hot piece of fried fish felt like luxury. And for tavern keepers, it was a win. Inexpensive, quick to cook, and guaranteed to keep customers happy and thirsty. In 2025 terms, you could fry up a whole batch for around $12, feeding 4 or 5 people easily. It was a dish that felt both old world and new world at once. Comfort borrowed from English inns, but flavored with colonial ale and American fish. And just when taverns mastered the art of frying, they turned back to the hearth, filling crusts with hearty meat pies that warmed every corner of the room. 21. Minced mutton pie. If fried fish brought cheer, minced mutton pie brought pure tavern comfort. Picture a deep crust packed with minced mutton, onions, carrots, maybe a splash of ale or broth, all baked until the filling was rich and the pastry golden. When the pie was cut open, steam poured out, carrying the smell of meat and herbs through the tavern. Mutton was cheap and plentiful, but often tough. By mincing it and baking it into a pie, tavern cooks turned scraps into something tender and flavorful. It was a clever way to stretch meat while still serving a dish that felt hearty and complete. This pie was a traveler's dream. You didn't need utensils, just a slice in hand with a mug of ale, and you had a meal that filled you up and warmed you through. In today's money, you could bake one for under $10 and feed a family of 4. Back then, it was an affordable staple that kept taverns profitable and bellies satisfied. And here's the charm. While roasted pig made a show and puddings felt sweet, the minced mutton pie was steady. It wasn't about impressing. It was about feeding people well, night after night. But taverns weren't only about the practical. Some dishes were designed to surprise, even delight, like a roasted bird small enough to fit on one plate, but rich enough to taste like a feast. 22. Roast pigeon with bread stuffing. Among the roasts and pies, taverns sometimes served a dish that felt both rustic and refined: roast pigeon with bread stuffing. Pigeons, or squab, were easy to catch, common around farms, and surprisingly tender when roasted. When stuffed with breadcrumbs, onions, herbs, and maybe a splash of cider, they turned into a small but flavorful feast. This wasn't the kind of meal that fed a crowd. Each pigeon served one person. That made it feel special, almost personal, compared to the giant pots of stew or shared roasts. For travelers who'd been living on jerky or cold rations, a whole bird on their plate felt like luxury, even if it was just a humble pigeon. Tavern keepers liked them too. Pigeons were cheap, and bread stuffing stretched the dish further while soaking up every drop of flavor. In today's terms, you could roast up a pigeon-sized bird for a few dollars. Back then, it was a smart way to serve something that felt indulgent without breaking the tavern's budget. And here's the kicker. While taverns roared with talk of independence, a plate of roast pigeon reminded diners of simple abundance, proof that even small meals could feel like feasts. But tavern cooks didn't stop with roasts. They also knew how to turn apples, eggs, and cream into a sweet custardy treat, unlike anything else on the table. 23. Apple tansy, fried apple custard. If roast pigeon brought savory comfort, apple tansy delivered sweet surprise. This colonial favorite was a kind of fried custard. Eggs, cream, and sugar whisked together, poured over sliced apples, then fried in a pan until golden and bubbling. Sprinkled with cinnamon or nutmeg, it was cut into wedges and served warm, like a cross between a pancake and a custard pie. The name tansy came from a bitter herb once used in earlier versions, but by the 1700s, taverns had sweetened the recipe, turning it into a dessert people actually craved. Apples were plentiful, eggs were cheap, and spices like cinnamon gave it that touch of indulgence tavern-goers loved. It was simple to make, yet it felt special, the kind of dish that turned everyday ingredients into something that felt like a reward after a long ride. In today's terms, you could whip up a pan for under $6, serving an entire family. Back then, it was cheap comfort, dressed up just enough to feel like a tavern treat. And here's the charm. Apple tansy wasn't flashy, but it had heart. A sweet, custardy bite of home in the middle of smoky rooms where revolution was being debated. But tavern menus also had dishes that shocked outsiders, meals so bold they proved nothing in colonial life went to waste. 24. Stewed calf's head. If apple tansy was gentle sweetness, stewed calf's head was the opposite, bold, unusual, and not for the faint of heart. In colonial taverns, nothing went to waste, and that meant using every part of the animal. A calf's head, simmered slowly with onions, herbs, and maybe a splash of wine or cider, became a dish both practical and surprisingly rich. The meat from the cheeks and tongue was tender, while the broth carried deep flavor. Sometimes the brains were mashed into the sauce, making it even thicker. To modern diners, this sounds shocking, but in the 1700s, it was normal. A whole head could feed several people, and it cost far less than prime cuts of beef. For tavern keepers, it was smart economics. What others saw as scraps became a hearty stew that drew no complaints from hungry travelers. And for those who ate it, stewed calf's head wasn't just food. It was proof of resilience, of making the most of what you had. In today's money, you could buy the ingredients for under $15, but back then it was survival cooking elevated into tavern fare. It may not have been glamorous, but it kept bellies full and spirits steady. And if that dish felt heavy, taverns had a way to wash it all down, with a hot, frothy drink that mixed beer, rum, and eggs into something unforgettable. 25. Ale flip, beer, rum, and egg tavern drink. To end a tavern meal, nothing hit harder, or felt more iconic, than the ale flip. This wasn't just a drink, it was a performance. A mug of beer, a splash of rum, sugar, and a beaten egg were mixed together, then heated with a red-hot poker straight from the tavern fire. The result? A frothy, steaming, slightly sweet drink with a smoky edge that warmed you to your core. The flip was more than refreshment. It was social glue. Picture a tavern full of travelers, the barkeep plunging an iron rod into mugs one by one, foam hissing and rising like magic. Every cheer, every toast, every whispered plan for rebellion seemed to flow easier after a round of flips. It was cheap to make, too. Beer was common, rum was imported in bulk, and eggs were easy to find. In today's terms, you could whip up a flip for about $2 a serving, proof that even simple ingredients could create something unforgettable. And here's the beauty of it. The flip wasn't just a drink, it was a ritual. It turned taverns into more than eating houses. They became places of camaraderie, debate, and, ultimately, revolution. Because sometimes history doesn't start with a speech. Sometimes it starts with a hot drink shared across a rough wooden table. Colonial taverns weren't just places to eat. They were the heartbeats of early America. Every dish told a story. Mutton stew kept farmers alive through winter. Roast pig marked celebrations. Clam chowder comforted weary riders. Gingerbread loaf carried sweetness into smoky rooms. Even bold meals like stewed calf's head proved nothing went to waste in a world built on survival. And it wasn't only about the food. These meals fueled debates, friendships, and even revolutions. In those dimly lit taverns, over tankards of cider and plates of pie, ideas of liberty and independence were whispered, argued, and toasted. The dishes weren't just filling bellies, they were feeding a nation's future. Looking back now, it's almost unbelievable how these humble meals connected people. They blended old-world traditions with new-world ingenuity, showing that food has always been more than fuel. It's community, it's memory, it's history you can taste. So the next time you bite into something simple, a fritter, a pie, or even a bowl of stew, remember, it just might be the kind of meal that carried America through its earliest, hardest days.